The Polaris series had a bit of a rocky start with the RX 400 series cards not quite reaching the bar set for them. It took a refresh in the form of the RX 500 series to get them to perform better. The RX 570 is one such card and is powered by the Polaris 20XL GPU. Built on the 40nm node from GlobalFoundries and using the GCN4 architecture, the GPU uses 2040 shader cores and is paired with 4GB of GDDR5 memory through a 256-bit bus. The GPU also makes available the VCE 3.4 video encoder. I'll spare you the rest of the details, the GPU-Z windows seen on screen should have those covered. I will however mention the TDP of the card of 150 watts. Keep in mind though that even at 100% usage, the GPU itself stays around the 120 watts power consumption. For this mini ITX version of the card, Sapphire opted for a cooling solution consisted of two heat pipes traversing a single set of cooling fins. The cold plate is large enough to cover not only the GPU, but also the memory chips and the DR MOSFETs that provide the already mentioned 120 watts. On top of the fin stack, Sapphire placed a large 87mm fan. With a fresh serving of Arctic's MX4 thermal paste, the entire card ran at 67 degrees maximum in heaven for a delta over ambient of 45. While a bit warm for my liking, this result is actually quite good, considering the small size of the card and the usage of a single fan. The same aggressive fan curve that I usually reserve for the R920X will keep this tiny card even cooler than the stock curve, by a difference of 15 degrees. To get the performance numbers that we'll see in the following section, the card ran in the same Z230 workstation with the same 4th gen i7-4772 equivalent Xeon and the same 32GB of DDR3 running at 1600 MHz in dual channel. I expect quite a few CPU bottlenecks when running this configuration at low settings, and this will be mentioned in the cases where it might negatively affect the gameplay. Sticking to tradition, the game results section is opened with Alien Isolation. At 1080 resolution and ultra settings, the RX 570 has no problem averaging 173 FPS. The 1% loss sits comfortably above 100 FPS. This is more than needed for the slow-paced single-player game. If you have a display that goes higher than Full HD, consider trading this performance excess for a higher resolution. Unlike the previous title, tested at ultra settings, Apex Legends was tested at low settings to maximize the frame rate. At 1080 resolution, the Polaris card manages an average of 155 FPS and 1% loss of 110. These values make low resolutions not really needed, but I did get the data for 1600 by 900 and 720 resolutions as seen on the screen. For science. Almost 190 FPS on average for 1600 by 900 and 220 for 720 resolution, with 1% loss above 130 FPS. The demo for Resident Evil 4 managed 75 FPS on average at 1080 resolution and low settings. The 1% loss creeps up to 50, which is more than adequate for this slow-paced single-player title. 720 resolution will increase those values to 100 FPS and 57 FPS respectively, though I would not try the resolution for the extra performance. It's not needed here. You will hear this a lot. In Battlefield 5, the RX 570 starts to pull ahead of the CPU, so this time around the FPS data is only for 1080 resolution. At low settings, the GPU managed an average of 88 FPS and the 1% loss of 56. This should be fine for a casual multiplayer match and more than adequate for the single-player campaign. For a higher FPS though, a faster CPU would help more than a faster GPU. The RX 570 can provide around 100 FPS on average in control, at 1080 resolution and low settings. The 1% loss of 84 FPS is more than adequate for the single-player title. It doesn't really make sense to drop the resolution to 720. The extra 72 FPS for the average and 12 for the 1% lows won't make that much of a difference. We already mentioned CPU bottlenecks in Rainbow Six Siege for a few previously reviewed video cards. To no surprise, the Polaris GPU is CPU bottlenecked. This can be clearly seen from the around same average FPS that we get for resolutions lower than full 1080. At Full HD, the card averages 180 FPS and provides 1% loss of 146. At any lower resolution, the 1% loss stays more or less the same and the average caps at just above 200 FPS. GTA 5 was tested at 1080 resolution low settings, and the RX 570 averaged 125 FPS. The 1% loss value was 72. I honestly expected some stutters caused by the game engine limitations, but the benchmark finished just fine. The results in the finals look weird, and there are unfortunately a few factors at play. The CPU that becomes a more and more effective bottleneck, and the ever-changing nature of multiplayer matches, coupled with the amount of destructibility this game allows. Regardless, numbers are numbers. Averages range between 69 and 78 FPS, with 1% lows from 26 to 40. Playing bot matches in Counter-Strike 2 is probably not the best way to benchmark the game, especially when the CPU is starting to wheeze while doing its best to keep up with the GPU. So, the results seen here on screen are again probably more relevant for the CPU. 132 to 160 FPS on average, for resolutions between 1080 and 720. The 1% lows stayed in the high 70 to low 80 FPS. I don't quite get this one. Dota seems to outright hate GC and Radeons. I've seen these 1080 low settings results on almost all R9 Radeon cards, and now on the RX 570. 90 FPS on average, 56 FPS for 1% lows is probably adequate for this title, but I have seen weaker Nvidia cards doing better. Fortnite also exhibited a clear CPU bottleneck, but this is actually expected. Performance mode was aimed at slower cards than the RX 570, so the numbers here are relevant for the CPU performance. An average between 170 and 180 FPS, and 1% lows ranging between 70 and almost 100 FPS. Between setting an FPS cap of say 144 or 120 FPS and choosing other rendering modes, I'd personally use performance mode, set a frame rate cap, and enjoy both the better visibility of this renderer and the high frame rate. Overwatch 2 is fairly light on the CPU side of things, although an usage of 50% and above means that all 4 cores are busy. Still, at 1080 resolution and low settings, the RX 570 averaged 272 FPS and provided a 1% loss figure above 200. The game runs perfectly fine, but I did test at lower resolutions. I was curious to see if the CPU starts to bottleneck. However, the ever-increasing averages of 362 and 455 FPS at 1600 by 900 and 720 respectively point out that the game is still fully GPU bound, and the FPS improved by the same ratio as the decrease in pixel count. At 1080 resolution and low settings, Rocket League struggles in the same CPU bound scenario that I mentioned before. The RX 570 averaged 261 FPS, which is more than needed for this game. The 1% low stayed at a comfortable 142 FPS. One can definitely trade performance for graphical options here. The Polaris GPU does have the headroom. Splitgate ends up as more of a strain on the CPU rather than the GPU, at 1080 resolution and low settings, as you probably expected by now. The Polaris GPU averaged almost 250 FPS, and the 1% low stayed above 100 FPS. This is more than adequate for this title, so there is no need to drop the resolution. 200 plus FPS in Valorant is not that hard at 1080 resolution and low settings. What is hard is to get good 1% lows, due to the CPU struggling to keep up the pace with the RX 570. And while the stats on the screen have 275 FPS for the average and 136 for the 1% lows, that latter metric read only 56 in the first benchmark run. So, consider an FPS cap around the 200 FPS mark, or bump up the visuals until the bottleneck is shifted from the CPU back to the GPU. Paladins, Royale and Rogue Company all ran just fine with the RX 570. I typically test at higher settings for Paladins and Royale and at low settings for Rogue Company, and at 1080 resolution I got the following results. Paladins snatched a victory from the jaws of defeat at 106 FPS on average and 65 FPS for the 1% lows. I managed to survive longer in Royale, and the 137 FPS for the average definitely helped. The 1% lows of 56 were not that much of a problem. And we dominated in Rogue Company at 142 FPS on average and 87 FPS for the 1% lows. I should not really test World of Tanks Blitz with this card at low settings. Weaker cards can get a 60 FPS average no problem. The RX 570 was no different, so there is room here to trade performance for an increase in resolution or visual quality or both. And as usually, we're closing the game results section with Warframe at 1080 resolution and low settings. In the same Mariana mission, the RX 570 got 311 FPS for the average and 1% lows of 175. Much more than what's needed in this PvE title. As always in such cases, feel free to trade the extra performance for some improved visuals. So, the $50 question, should you buy one of these? while the price for this is getting lower, reaches as low as the aforementioned $50. Keep in mind that a lot of these cards have seen their fair share of cryptocurrency mining. The 4GB versions were still a viable option up until late 2020, when the size of the DAG went over 4GB, while 8GB card remained cost-effective all the way until the end of the Ethereum mining. Starting with September 2023, the driver for the GCN 4 and 5 architectures was split from the driver package for RDNA 1, 2 and 3. The intent here is to maintain driver support for Polaris and Vega, but only limited to bug fixes. If you are more of a casual gamer who doesn't mind low settings, then the RX 570 might just do it for you. As for myself, besides performance alone, one other reason that I like the RX 570 is its power consumption. This mini ITX version of the card is powered from a single 6-pin PCIe power connector. The original PSU for the workstation I use also has just one 6 power connector, a match made in heaven. We're done with this video. Thank you for your time, I hope you liked it, and I'll see you for the next one.